In Phoenix, Arizona, paramedics were called to a mobile home during a heat wave. Inside, they found a 70-year-old woman, unresponsive. Her air conditioning unit was sitting right there against the wall. It just was not running. Her body temperature had reached 107 degrees Fahrenheit. This was not someone who had been outside working in the sun. This was not someone without access to cooling. She had air, conditioning. She had simply lost the few dollars a month or the few hours of power that kept it running. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. Across Maricopa County, home to Phoenix, more than 150 heat deaths in a single year happened indoors, in homes that had a working cooling unit installed. Not out on the street, not in the desert. Inside, behind walls, under a roof, in the exact place public health officials have spent decades telling people is the safest spot to be during extreme heat. The advice everyone has heard for 50 years, stay inside, stay cool, run the air conditioning, is starting to fail the people who follow it. And the reason has less to do with the heat itself than with something far more fragile sitting behind it. The electricity that makes an air conditioner anything more than a very large, very expensive paperweight. If stories like this matter to you, hit the like button. It takes real research to get numbers like this right, and subscribe so you catch the next one. Here's what you're about to learn. Why indoor heat deaths are now outpacing outdoor ones. What actually happens inside a sealed modern home once the power fails? Why the people most protected by air conditioning are often the most vulnerable when it disappears, and what cities are quietly doing right now to try to stop this pattern before it gets worse. Let's start with a fact that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Most heat deaths do not happen outside. For most of the 20th century, the public image of a heat death was straightforward. Someone caught outdoors, working construction, hiking a trail, exposed directly to the sun with no shade and no water. That image is not wrong, but it is incomplete, and increasingly it is not even the majority of cases. When a heat dome settled over the Pacific Northwest in 2021, pushing temperatures in normally mild cities into the triple digits, investigators later found that 98% of the more than 600 deaths recorded in British Columbia happened inside homes. Not outside, inside. New York City's own health department has tracked this pattern for years and reached the same conclusion from a different angle. Their data consistently shows that lack of home air conditioning is the single most important risk factor for heat stress death, and that among people who die from heat stress, the most common place of death is an apartment or house without a working cooling system. The pattern holds in Europe too, where only about 1 in 10 households has air conditioning at all. Heat waves there killed an estimated 60,000 people in 2022 and 47,000 in 2023. Overwhelmingly in homes and buildings that were never designed to handle the temperatures they now regularly face. This is the part that reframes the whole problem. It is not that air conditioning fails to work, it is that access to it and the reliability of it is nowhere near as universal or as guaranteed as most people assume. And when it disappears, even briefly, the space it was protecting becomes something closer to an oven than a shelter. What actually happens once the power goes out? A modern, well-sealed home is efficient. That is normally a good thing. It keeps cooled or heated air where you want it and keeps outside air where you do not. But that same efficiency becomes a serious liability the moment the air conditioning stops. Large windows designed to let in light rather than open for airflow, tight insulation, and minimal cross-ventilation all combine to trap heat rather than release it once mechanical cooling disappears. Engineers and public health researchers who study this have measured how fast this is alarming than most people expect. In an outdoor temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit, a home interior without any cooling can reach dangerous body temperature threshold levels within 1 to 2 hours, and upper floors and poorly ventilated rooms heat up fastest of all. That is not a slow afternoon drift. That is a window of 1 to 2 hours between the moment the power cuts out and the moment the space someone is sitting in becomes a genuine medical threat. The most dangerous part of this is psychological, not physical. When the power first goes out during a heat wave, almost nobody treats it as an emergency. People wait. They assume utility crews will have it fixed within the hour. They open a window. They tell themselves it is fine. That instinct, entirely reasonable in almost every other power outage scenario, is exactly the behavior that turns a routine outage into a medical emergency once the outdoor temperature is high enough and the outage stretches past that 1 to 2 hour window. Researchers who study heat behavior describe this as a kind of learned complacency. Someone who has never lived without air conditioning has no internal calibration for how dangerous heat actually feels without it. No memory of the coping habits, drawing curtains at dawn, moving to the lowest floor, soaking a towel in cold water that earlier generations relied on automatically. Air conditioning did not just cool homes, it quietly erased a set of survival behaviors that used to be common knowledge, which means the loss of power removes both the cooling and the backup plan at the exact same moment. Why the most protected people are often the most exposed. Here's the pattern that shows up again and again in heat mortality research, and it is deeply counterintuitive. The people most likely to die from indoor heat are not the people who lack air conditioning entirely and have learned to cope without it. They are overwhelmingly people who have air conditioning, rely on it completely, and have therefore lost whatever behavioral habits, cooling strategies, or physical tolerance might have helped them survive without it. This shows up clearly in the Maricopa County data, one of the most detailed indoor heat death investigations in the country. In the majority of indoor heat deaths investigated there, a cooling unit was physically present in the home. It simply was not running because the power was out, because the electricity bill had gone unpaid and service was disconnected, or because, in one documented case, an extension cord supplying power to a unit had come unplugged and nobody noticed in time. These were not people without a plan. They were people whose entire plan depended on a system that quietly failed them. Age and isolation compound the danger sharply, layering physiology on top of circumstance. Older adults produce and retain heat differently than younger people, often cannot feel the early warning signs of heat stress as clearly, and are frequently on medications that interfere with the body's ability to regulate temperature in the first place. Combine that physiology with living alone, which removes the chance that someone nearby notices something is wrong, and you get the exact demographic profile that shows up over and over in indoor heat death statistics. People over 60, living alone with limited income, in a home that had cooling but lost it. The grid itself is now part of the danger. This problem does not exist in isolation from the electrical grid. And in a strange way, air conditioning itself makes the grid more fragile at precisely the moment everyone needs it most. Heat is already the leading weather-related cause of death in the United States, responsible for more than 13,000 deaths since 2018, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and that toll is climbing alongside both rising temperatures and rising dependence on mechanical cooling. When a heat wave hits a region hard, millions of air conditioners switch on and stay on simultaneously, pushing electricity demand to its highest point of the entire year, right as extreme heat is also placing physical strain on transformers, power lines, and generating stations. That combination, peak demand meeting peak physical stress on the system, is exactly the scenario that triggers rolling blackouts and localized outages. New York State understood this well enough to act on it directly. In June 2026, during a severe heat wave, the governor deployed over 5,500 utility workers across the state and activated the state's Emergency Operations Center specifically to respond to the strain millions of simultaneously running air conditioners were placing on the Region L grid. Roughly 80 million Americans were under some form of heat alert at the same time. That is not a routine staffing decision. That is a government treating a hot week as a genuine infrastructure emergency because officials know exactly what a widespread outage during that kind of heat would mean. The historical precedent for this fear is not hypothetical. During a 1999 blackout in the Washington Heights neighborhood of New York City, which struck in the middle of a heat wave, investigators documented a measurable spike in heat-related deaths in the affected area, specifically because residents lost cooling at the worst possible moment. More recently, hurricane-driven power outages have produced the same lethal pattern well after the storm itself has passed, sometimes days later, once the winds and flooding have already faded from the headlines. Multiple hurricanes since 2017, including Beryl in 2024, which contributed to 14 heat-related deaths in the Houston area alone, have caused clusters of fatalities in the days following landfall, not from the storm's winds or flooding, but from the heat wave that followed once the power stayed off across entire neighborhoods for days at a time. What is actually being done, and what still is not? The response so far has focused mostly on the grid side of the problem. Utility companies pre-positioning repair crews before major heat events, states activating emergency operations centers earlier in the season, and some cities expanding public cooling centers and lowering the temperature threshold at which they open them. Arizona passed a new law requiring mobile home parks, previously allowed to bar residents from installing window units or shade structures for aesthetic reasons, to permit those modifications, closing off one of the more absurd gaps in heat protection policy. But the harder problem, the one nobody has fully solved, is the affordability gap sitting underneath all of it. Energy assistance. Advocates have been blunt about this, describing air conditioning not as a luxury but as a public health necessity that a meaningful share of the population still cannot reliably afford to run, especially during the exact stretch of summer when electricity rates and usage both spike at the same time. A cooling unit installed in a home does nothing for the person inside it if the electricity bill goes unpaid during exactly the week that unit is needed most. Every solution aimed at the grid, more resilient transformers, faster repair crews, smarter outage response, addresses only half of a problem where the other half is simply the cost of running the machine that keeps a person alive. What this all points to is a quieter, less visible version of a climate risk most people still picture as an outdoor problem. As summers grow longer and heat waves grow more. If this changed how you think about heat safety, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. There are more videos on the screen if you want to. Keep exploring. Here's a question worth sitting with. As heat waves keep intensifying, should keeping the power on during extreme heat be treated as seriously as keeping the water running, a guaranteed utility, not something that can simply be shut off? Let me know in the comments.